day. My name is Dan Davis, President of ADK Wealth Advisory Group, talking with you from our headquarters in St. Louis. Our focus today is on China. In order to really do China justice, we have to look back into their imperial dynasties all the way up to the current reality and then look forward to what our expectations are. Now, why are we doing this? Quite simply, it's so that as we think of investing and managing risk, we can think in terms of how do we allocate towards Asia and why. As we look at the imperial history of China, I think it's very important that we start with the fact that as we look at history, most of the history that we're studying is written by people from the West, and we're looking at it from our Western perspective. That really isn't good enough when you try to understand something as different from the West as the East. However, it's the best that we can do. So I'm going to use some examples, but I think those examples are imperfect, but they help us to understand. So if you go back and you take a look at Imperial China, and you take a look at the period that we call Warring States, if you forward into Europe and you think about before different country borders were established, you can take something as simple as Greece, and you can see you had Sparta fighting with Macedonia, etc., states warring against each other. You had the same thing going on in China. And what was significant is that in the Qin dynasty, starting around 221 BC, they defeat the warring states, and it's really the first time that you see China centralize around a bureaucracy and an empire. And that happened, just to kind of put it in perspective, around 55 years after the beginning of the Roman Empire. Then you can kind of fast forward time and you can go to the Tang Dynasty, starting off about 618 AD to 907 AD. The significance here is that China becomes the cosmopolitan center of world trade. To put it in perspective, the Roman Empire had collapsed and Europe had spiraled into the Dark Ages in that same period. Between the Tang Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty, you had chaos in China where you had the North and the South divide, and the Mongols were able to come in and conquer, and they ruled very harshly. Very significant because this is the first time after China had ruled supremely that an outside force comes in and creates havoc. Then you had the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD. They defeated the Mongols, and China regains its world trade leadership. Things like tea, silk, porcelain were some of the main trade. Then you take a look at the Qing Dynasty, and I guess you could just kind of summarize it by all good things must come to an end. During the Qing Dynasty, this is where China started its decline due to corruption, due to lackadaisical leadership. You had a scenario where China just lost its supremacy. Some of the big embarrassments that were from that time started really with the Opium Wars. And Opium Wars, I didn't recall this from high school history, but you had the first drug state, which was Great Britain. If you can imagine back in the Reagan era, Colombia with cocaine, that's really what Great Britain was with opium at that time. The Opium Wars broke out because China was trying to push that opium out, and Great Britain was trying to export it in. It was creating lots of problems. The net effect is Great Britain defeated them in 1842 and took over Hong Kong. The shame that that brought to China was very, very big. And in our culture, we don't really understand shame. But what I can tell you, growing up, having gone to a Catholic high school, that guilt was something that back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was part of our culture. I don't really think that we see that as much, but in the Eastern culture, shame is a very, very powerful motivator. And again, you had an outside force coming in and defacing and shaming China. So that was the sort of the end of the imperial dynasty. 1912 is when they officially say that that occurred, and that ushered in the Republic of China. And so in the Republic of China, you have the dynasty era collapse, you have this vacuum of leadership, and a power struggle ensues. And in that power struggle, Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party wins the power struggle. And anytime you have that kind of a major power struggle, there's always enemies that are made. The next leader, Mao Zedong, is one of those leaders. Betrayed by Chiang Kai-shek, in 1949, he ends up overthrowing Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party flees to Taiwan. So a lot of times when we see all this tension between China and Taiwan, I don't think that we really understand the history behind that. In 1978, after Mao's death, and you had this fearsome four vying for power, Deng Xiaoping, even though he experienced enormous setbacks during Mao's leadership, he was able to come to power, and he was really the main force behind reorganizing the economy and setting the stage for what we see now. His leadership from our Western perspective is tarnished because of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And you can kind of forward up to just current reality, where you see Xi Jinping. Like Deng, he had setbacks during the Mao regime. He's now the most powerful supreme leader. He's been very active in reforming corruption, and he's trying to usher in what we'll call, from an Eastern perspective, the Chinese dream. And as part of that, it's kind of a subjective thing. What is the Chinese dream? But it really is to regain that era of the Tang and Ming dynasty where China was the supreme economy, the supreme country throughout the world. They're on the way. You now have more billionaires in Beijing than New York. And when you take a look at modern day China and the economy, which is really where we're going with all this, it's impossible to do that without really taking a look at the South China Sea. The South China Sea, the ocean itself, as well as the airspace above, is a major, major battlefield. When you take a look at what's happened historically and you take a look at what China's trying to accomplish with the Chinese dream, this is a playing field that's very important. And what do I mean by that is you take a look at a quote that was put together by Justin Leverins in his Oppenheimer phone conference in July. Justin, incidentally, is the portfolio manager for the Oppenheimer Developing Markets Fund. He made the statement that, and I'll quote, "We are in a period where most nations are taking a nationalistic stance over a global stance. This chauvinistic perspective is prevalent due to increased competition and low growth. This, combined with past colonization and Japanese occupation, has the current communist regime in a mood to ignore all outside demands." I think the summary of it is that this area is important for commerce, both for shipping as well as freight in air. But yet there's enormous contention between Japan, Vietnam, North and South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, over whose space is this. And I think that you're going to see a lot of skirmishes in this. So when we really then take all of this and we say, okay, what does it mean economically? If you take a look at the infrastructure of China, you couldn't have a better infrastructure built, both for manufacturing, the highway system around it, for what they're trying to accomplish. Enormous pollution, obviously. When you take a look at a population in the globe, it's estimated that there's over 7.3 billion people on the globe. Shockingly, when you take a look at China, about over 1.3 billion people are Chinese. When you take a look at India, it's the second largest populated country, 1.27 billion. A distant third is the United States at a little bit over 300 million. And then you have Indonesia and Brazil running up in fourth and fifth. Now, when we take a look at population, we then start to take a look at, well, what's their middle class like? Since 1978, over 700 million Chinese have been lifted up out of poverty. From 1990 to 2014, their per-person income has gone up 13-fold. When you compare that to the rest of the world, it's a 3 times. So the rest of the world's income's gone up 3 times per person versus 13-fold. The IMF measures middle class. They put it somewhere in US dollars between 12 and 43 grand a year of income. In the early 2000s, there were less than 5 million Chinese in the middle class. As of 2016, there's 225 million. So 5 million to 225 million. The growth is hard for us to even fathom, especially when we put it in the context of our middle class having stagnated and actually gone backwards. So some headwinds that they're really faced with are what I'm going to classify as debt. When you take a look at Chinese debt, in 2008, they had about 150% of debt to GDP. By 2016, that had climbed to 250%. The sheer number of it nominally is staggering, but putting it in perspective to the rest of the large economies in the world, they're in the middle of the pack, and they're slightly above the United States. Now, when you take the debt and you put it into different pieces, and you say, okay, well, what about corporate debt? Corporate debt is very different. It's when you measure their corporate debt, they're at the top of the list. So the corporate debt's where they really have their problems. Now, the saving grace that they have, one, is they have low government debt. They have high cash, both based on currency reserves, and they have a very good economy. Those things will allow them to be able to weather that upcoming storm. And I do say storm intentionally because I believe that you're going to start to see corporate debt default in China. I believe that Xi will use that as a way of figuring out who's he going to support, and they have money to recapitalize them, and who is he going to let fail. And then that will be more of a political thing than an economic thing, but it will manifest itself in the corporate debt failures. Now, when I take a look at the future for China, and I take a look at sort of a macro level, it really gets down to, I believe that Asia is going through what the United States went through post-World War II. And that's going to mean enormous growth. It's also going to mean setbacks. If you take a look at what happened with the U.S. post-World War II, we had big run-ups economically, pullbacks with recessions, run-ups, pullbacks. That's what I see them experiencing. Now, when I put it in terms of China, China wants to fulfill the Chinese dream. They want China to be number one, not number two. Being the number two economy in the world is not good enough. And they want to revisit that Tang and Ming dynasty supremacy. So when I take a look at sort of a micro issue around all that, they have some real issues around an overbuilt infrastructure with corporate debt, commented on that already. On an intermediate and longer term, they're going to have to really battle corruption, pollution. They're going to have to make sure that Xi keeps their military elite in check. And then they're going to have a struggle between their middle class and rural Chinese that want to be middle class. How do you balance all that with new jobs, etc.? The long and short of it is that I believe that when I look forward, that China will continue to do well. I believe that the U.S. and the Asian economies will be the two areas that do the best. When I take a look at places like Latin America or Europe, I believe that they will lag. There will be times where Latin America and Europe have their day in the sun. Maybe a country or two are the best performing for a given year. But over the next 20 years, the U.S. and Asia, where China is the heartbeat, I believe will do the best. So you're going to be seeing inside of our portfolios increased recommendations around adding to the emerging market space over the next 6 months to 2 years. On that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and more importantly, thank you for the trust that you placed in ADK Wealth Advisory Group to help you. We thank you for that. Also would like to ask you for your help in introducing us to people that you care about, whether they're coworkers, people that you are socialized with, that you respect and honor, or family members. Many times they're looking for someone that can give them wisdom from an advice perspective. With us being a fiduciary and taking the legal stance to do what's best for you, we would hope that you would know that we'll take great care of them. The best way to do that is to reach out to us, let us know they're interested. We can either send them an email or follow up with a call. Again, thank you very much and have a great day.